Hello, and welcome to another FHIR for Developer introductory video. My name again is Gino Canessa. I'm a senior software engineer with Microsoft, working on standards and interop in healthcare. And today's video is all about HTTP interactions with FHIR servers. We're going to go through the basics, and again, if you're familiar with REST, a lot of this may be review, but it's important to build these things from the ground up, I always feel. Today we're going to focus on just the core of these interactions without any security. There's a standard security model that we'll get into for all of these things later, probably in the next video. As always, links are in the GitHub repo for this video, and that should make it a little easier to follow along. So with that, let's jump right in. We're going to start off again at the FHIR standard page. And in this case, we're going to look at the REST API page. And again, we've pulled this up before, and we can see it's this HTTP page, RESTful API. For people who've used REST APIs before, this is going to be pretty similar. It's structured, again, like most REST APIs, that you have these levels of interactions based on the URL. So I actually like going through these in the opposite direction, and starting with the whole system interactions. So at the base URL for the server, you'll have things like getting the capabilities of the server. So finding out what the server supports, things like that, what search parameters are available, what resources are available, if you can read, if you can write, all of those things, that's covered for the whole system. If you do batch operations, that you have multiple updates that are all together in a transaction, or you're trying to submit a large number of patient creates at the same time, things like that. Again, those are handled at the system level. And some servers support history and search and things like that at that same level. So again, base URL, system level operations. From there, we jump into the type level interactions. These are going to be things based off of the resources that we were covering before. So patient, observation, encounter, imaging study, medication request, care plan, whatever those things are. Those are what we're going to be using as type level interactions here. And again, if you're familiar with REST, they make sense. If you want to do a create that the server assigns an ID, well, you want to create a new patient and you don't know the ID for it, you create it at the patient level. Same thing if you're searching for a patient, you wouldn't be searching with the ID, and you wouldn't want to search just the whole system for anything that has a name matching that patient. You want to say, okay, here within the patient type, do this search. And again, history, some servers will allow for that kind of searching and some won't. From there, we get down into the instance level interactions. And so these are the things that have an ID on the resource. So if you want to read, so I'm not looking for a patient, I know my patient ID and I just want that patient record. Versioned read, again, some servers will support going back through history and seeing all the prior versions that were there. Updating, so again, there's a note here. You can either update an existing resource by ID or create if it's new. And some servers will let you do this and some won't. Some will have rules saying, well, if you give me a GUID or a UUID, okay, I'll create that, and vice versa. So again, that's within one instance. Same thing with patch, delete, history. Again, these are all things that make sense at this level. We can see here, this is kind of breaking down the same thing we just talked through. So in general, it's the REST API, so we'll have a verb, so get, post, put, delete, the base URL for the server, the type or resources more generally, and then the ID. And all of these are optional depending on what level you're going to. Obviously not the base URL. That's just showing that it's a replacement. And then parameters. So there's some kind of generically defined parameters that are kind of useful everywhere, and then different operations, or if you're doing search, there'll be search parameters based on the resource, things like that that you can append here. So in this case, they're clearly calling out the format, so you can specify the MIME type. And FHIR actually allows you to do this in either way. There's an accept header on the HTTP request, or you can put it here in the URLs directly. And that's because some servers, depending on how you're set up, you may not have access to changing the MIME types that the server actually supports in headers. So it's a good way to support that more generically. So we can come down and see, again, if we scroll through, we can see some examples that we're looking at, within a patient, etc. I'm going to jump down here to a couple of notes. So the first one here is that there's this prefer header. So again, this is using the HTTP return preference. So this is a standard header, but we can ask for a few different types of returns. Now the server is going to do what it needs to do regardless. So in some cases, for instance, if you ask for a representation, so you say, give me the resource back. Well, if it errored and the server couldn't create it, it's probably going to give you an operation outcome anyway, because that's what it needs to do. In different cases, if you have, for instance, security, authentication, things like that, you're going to end up getting a minimal response because they're not going to go ahead and tell you some of the other information that you might be asking for. I did mention earlier the MIME types. So again, and this is worth reading through, but we touched on it last time as well in the last video, that we have application FHIR XML and application FHIR JSON. Those are kind of the standards that we use. There are some differences. So if you just look at JSON or you just look at XML, this has a little bit of a layer on top of it. In JSON, there's some different serialization rules and things like that. And those are all described on pages we linked to last time. So let's see. Other than that, the FHIR version is important to note. You'll want to connect to a server that matches the FHIR version. Some servers can support multiple, and if they're supporting multiple, then there's a way to put that in there. All right. So moving on here, we see general parameters. Now these are the things we were talking about earlier. One of them, the format. So you can see that it's just describing a way to override the HTTP content negotiation. So normally there's the content type and accept headers. And in this case, we're saying, well, sometimes you need to put in a URL something to override that. So if you happen to just say text XML, but in the format you say it's FHIR XML, then it knows it can treat it that way. Same thing as we go through and look, there's a few of these other ones. So the pretty printed parameter. This is, again, if you're looking at XML or JSON, how much white space is there. If the pretty is false, then it's going to do the condensed version. And then if pretty is true, then it'll have the nice new line so that it's an indentation so that it's easy to read if the server supports that. All right. So with that, we start getting into reads and everything else and actually doing these interactions. The problem is we need a server to test against. Luckily, and again in the links, we'll have this page here as well. This is the confluence page. So the FHIR standard is published here. You can see the hl7.org, and all of this template will be very familiar because this will be all of the core standard, the implementation guides, everything else. Confluence is kind of like a wiki site for people who aren't familiar, that it's just additional information that's not controlled through the publication process. So in this case, this page is public test servers. It wouldn't make sense to try and publish that as part of the release, but everything here has to be content controlled and go through a balloting process and everything else. So in this case, we have a list of quite a few public test servers. And again, a lot of this is because you can see we have an R4, we have an STU3, we have a DSTU2, some have security, some don't, some require registration, some don't, but these are all public test servers that anyone can go ahead and use. Now, I'm going to actually use the Happy reference server. And this is a Java-based server maintained by a wonderful group of people. Smile CDR, I believe, is the main umbrella that's supporting everything. And they do excellent stuff here for Java. And this is kind of the main one that a lot of people will use. So we can see there's a web UI, which we'll touch on here in a minute, and then an STU2, 3, 4, and 5 endpoints. So we can go ahead and do everything. So if I go ahead and copy that URL over and look at Postman, oops, we have our testing stuff here from before. We can go ahead and say we want to do a get at the base URL for the FHIR endpoint. And we'll go and do our get, and we get this operation outcome. So again, operation outcome is a resource telling us kind of something happened. In this case, it's telling us we had an error, and that error is that it's the base URL of the server, and we didn't actually ask it to do anything. That's a fair assessment of what we did. In our case, again, on the HTTP page, we come back here, we can find metadata. And this is how we get the capabilities of the server. So if we go ahead and just add metadata and do our request, oh, fantastic. You can see we got a capability statement, and it has all kinds of information. You can see we support FHIR XML and FHIR JSON, and we can see there's a server here, and it has things like account. We can find things like a patient. All of these different resources are supported. And in this case, for instance, patient, we can do read, we can do a version read, update, patch, delete, all kinds of things. You can also see we have search include. So that's a way of traversing and getting additional dependent resources. And then there's even the listings of what search parameters are allowed on the server. So these are ones that they have implemented, and you can see they have the name, the type, and some short documentation describing it. Generally speaking, these are going to line up. And again, since we're looking at patient, search parameters are down here at the bottom. And so you can see that these same search parameters that we're talking through, like birth date, patient's date of birth, patient.birth date, and we have here birth date, patient's date of birth. So the specification defined all these things, and here is the implementation saying this is what this server actually does and supports. Now, in this case, we didn't specify what file format we wanted back, and so it just gave us its default, which happens to be FHIR JSON. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and start so that we can see the difference here. If we go ahead and say accept, we can say application FHIR JSON, and we'll go ahead and get back the same thing because it's that's what it gave us before. But we can come back here just as easily and change this to FHIR XML. And now you can see we have an XML document instead of a JSON document. Generally speaking, servers will support both. Some servers do support only one or the other. A lot of it is dependent on where you're coming from. If you are, for instance, coming from the HL7 v2, v3 world, CCDA, some of these other things, you're much more embedded in an XML workflow, and that's just the tooling that you'll have and everything else. And so that's kind of where that side comes from. And then on the other side, if you're doing web, cloud, some of these things, JSON is going to be much more comfortable and familiar for you. And personally, that's what I prefer. So generally, when I do everything, you'll see set to FHIR JSON. Now we can, again, override this, just like we were talking about. So we can come here and say the same thing. We can say, well, we want the format to be FHIR XML. So in this case, we had our default accept, ***, but we specifically told it, give us the FHIR XML, or give us the FHIR JSON in the URL itself. Perfect. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave it down here so that we have a cleaner URL. Now, again, if you're not familiar with Postman or whatever else, we can see we can do the same thing if we want to do curl So we can do request get happy.fhir.org. I'm going to actually move this so we can actually see the URL we're using. Happy.fhir.org base R4 metadata. And same thing, we're going to add a header. We're going to add an accept application FHIR JSON. And you can see we went and got the same JSON file that we got before. And same thing if we go ahead and change this to XML. Now you can see we got the same thing in an XML document. So these are just straight HTTP requests going through to the server. Pretty straightforward. Now, again, we said one of the nice features of this particular test server is this UI that lays on top of it. So you can see some of the same options we were just talking about. There's the encoding here for XML or JSON. There's the pretty printing and the summary one that we didn't really talk to. And we'll get to that in a minute. But you can see that this is the same thing. If we want to click here and look at the conformance statement, that's what the capability statement used to be called. And so they've left it for familiarity on that side. You can see we're getting the same thing. Now in this case, they're showing the same pieces of data we were. We're doing a get to that URL. Here are the headers. Here's the response. And then there's the contents. But let's come over and say we want to look at patients. So same thing. We can do it either in the UI here or in our URL HTTP utility of choice. But in this case, I want to search for patients. So I came over here and clicked on patient. And so now I'm playing in the patient resource area. And I want to look for patients that have a name that matches test. So as I do this, now that's not, again, we can see here in this case, they have the resource counts here. So 130,000 patients here. So the query took, and it's giving us some diagnostic data. It's giving us client code. So if you're using the Java API, this is how you would actually go ahead and do it. And then we can see the request, the response, and then they have the nice formatted version and the raw version. So we were searching for patients. You can see we got back a bundle. So just like normal, we can go into the FHIR specification. Now, if we want to, we can, again, start from the home page, go to resources, and in this case, since we know we're looking by name, we can just go for alphabetical and look at bundle. Now, there's also the naming convention up here, so you can see it's just hl7org.org, FHIR, and then bundle. So this bundle resource is a container resource. It's just a way of saying, you know, the return shouldn't be sometimes a resource and sometimes an array of resources. And you don't want to always return an array of resources because that's awkward as well. And so here, this is a container. So there's some different types. And same thing, we can go through here and say, oh, there's this bundle type. And what does that mean? Oh, well, again, everything here is pretty well documented. So we can see there's 9 concepts of the bundle type. There's a document, and that's telling us that it has to include a composition. It's a message, so it has to have a message header. It's a transaction, so, you know, an atomic commit, so on and so forth. The one we're particularly interested in is search set, search results. So you can see that is one of the types, and if we come here and look, we should see, yes, the type is search set. So we can see that that does match that it is the search set. So if we come back and look at the bundle again, we can follow through here and see how it's defined, and we can follow through here and see an example of it. So in this case, we're saying, oh, we have an entry, we have a full URL. So this is the URL we could use if we wanted to just get this patient. So for instance, if we want to come over to Postman and paste that in and say we're doing a get, Now we can see, oh, we actually got the patient resource instead of the bundle. So here, again, since we gave not just the patient, not just the type, but the ID, so we're looking for the instance, then it makes sense we got back the patient resource. So it just goes through and you can see it has all this information and it just goes through and lists them. So in this case, we can see, again, they have a nice little broken up view of them. What I will note too is we have 20 entries. Out of 130,000 patients on a test server, that's pretty unlikely that it is exactly 20. In this case, it's even showing us that we have a next page up here. So if we look in the bundle itself, we can see there's this link area. And so same thing, we can come back and see how it's defined, but we can see there's a relationship and then the URL. So in this case, it's telling us self, so this is the page you asked for, and then there's also a page for a relation for next and another URL. So paging through results, we would just want to hit this next URL. So in this case, we can just click this button and it'll do it for us. And go ahead and update. There we go. So you can see now we have a new request, and we were saying start at offset 20 and get the next 20. There's no guarantee of what format this looks like. It can be perfectly opaque or perfectly transparent like it is here. But in this case, happy the server's implemented so that it's done this way. Now, I will also call out another note here. If we go look at this link again, first now we have 3, and the one that we would expect is a little different. So same thing, we still have a self, and that's the page that we currently requested, which makes sense. We were on the next set of 20, so we have offset of 20, and we asked for another 20. The next, well, makes sense again. It's asking at offset 40 and asking for the next 20. But the previous, you can see now it's changed our format. Instead of our original request URL, it has us in this page mode where it's saying start at offset 0 and get 20. And that's good to note, is that these URLs can change. Just because you would expect the previous to be the same as it was in the last one, or the next, or the self, that's not necessarily true. So the servers have a lot of flexibility in what they can do here, and so you want to make sure you're always coming and pulling these as you're doing them. So we can see that we can search and get a bundle. In this case, again, we were searching based on the name, but let's say we want to do some creating, right? That's not so interesting to just look at existing data. Now, again, we'll have a link in the GitHub repo, but if we look on the main FHIR page, there's this directory of published versions. And this has, again, all the different versions that have been published, and it has these nice links over here. The one we're looking at right now is a package for examples. And this is just a very large set of example data. It's all of the examples off the FHIR server. So if we were just looking for a patient, again, we can come to patient. Let me scroll back up. We have a tab examples, and we can actually look at them here as well. So you can see there's a general person example, and we can look at a JSON version of this. Or if you download that package, as I have, then you can come here and see all of the different examples all in one nice directory in your code editor of choice. So in this case, we can see we have a patient, it has the ID, it has all this other information, but it's a relatively short example. Now, we're going to let the server assign an ID, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that here. And we're going to come back to Postman, and since we're letting the server generate the ID, we're going to do a type level. It's a post, because again, we're asking the server to generate the ID and give us back. We're going to, just like we have the accept, we're going to set the content type to application FHIR JSON. And we're going to go ahead and put a body, that data we just picked up. So when we send this request, we actually get back an error. In this case, you can see there's an operation outcome, and we can see that in processing, there was an error that said resource contains a reference to the unknown resource organization 1. So if we come back and look at our example, yes, we have text and identifiers and all of these things. If we scroll down a little, we can see we have this managing organization. And this is a field, again, if you want to look it up, you can come into patient and see, oops, there we go, content, and we can see managing organization, the organization that's custodian of the patient record. Well, organization 1 doesn't happen to exist on this server. We haven't created it. So it's yelling at us that it can't fulfill our request. So we want to go ahead and remove that because we're just playing anyway. This is just test data. And actually, we want to go ahead and remove this link to patient 2 as well, because that also does not exist. So now if we come here and update our contents, oops, and I mistyped that. Now when we send, fantastic, we can see we get back our result. So we have a patient, and now it's mostly the same data, but we can see we do have this ID. I'm going to go ahead and copy that and save it off screen just in case we need it here in a little bit. So we can see that now we have our patient resource. It's been created. We got a 201 created back. It's done whatever shuffling it needed to in anything else. So if we want to, and actually I'll just go ahead and duplicate this tab to make my life easier. So now we can see we can look at patient, and if we wanted to, we can do, for instance, a search in the patient, and we can say the ID, oops, equals that ID that we just got back. And now, since we did a search, even though we gave it an ID, you can see we got back a bundle. And again, we did anything at the type level, that's what we're going to get back, is a bundle. So even though it's search set, one result, that's still here. And you can see this full URL is the one directly to it. So again, if we duplicate this tab, and instead of doing it this way, we go following our RESTful model and put the slash here instead, so we're doing this in the URL. When we send, now we can see we got back a patient resource instead of a bundle. So that makes sense. The search semantics are pretty complicated when you start wanting to really get into it. And again, there's a link there on the GitHub repo. But there's a whole page to search. There's some videos that I'll link to as well. There's a lot of data here. So there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. Well, first are these special parameters, like we've already been using ID. There's different things about sorts and counts and things. Again, just because they're defined doesn't mean a server has to support them or support them on every query. So some will allow counts and things like that in some scenarios and not in others, and go through there. But in this case, we can see we have this ID, right? And that's what we've been playing with. But one of the things you can do in search, if we come here and post this same patient again, so we have a second ID, we can actually come to our URL and say we want to search for both IDs. And same thing, I'll save this off screen so that we have it here for reference. But now we can see I'm doing a patient search and I'm doing for either one of these IDs. And that comma syntax is defined in search. So now you can see we have a bundle and we have a search set of 2 resources. So same thing, it all works just like you would expect in a RESTful API, but in this case we're using this bundle container around it. Now, same thing, we can come here and ask for this additional patient, or since we're doing everything very RESTfully, we can come and say, delete this patient. Delete, again, it wouldn't make sense to return the resource. So in this case, it returned the operation outcome, and we said, okay, information, successfully deleted a resource. We'll come back to search. You'll see now, even though we're asking for both IDs, the other one's gone. Makes sense, we only got our one back. So I'm not going to go too far into search in this video, just because, again, this is its own topic, which can go for quite a long time. But just in general, there's the semantics that are covering the syntax for covering different types of searches. So for instance, we've been using ID, which is a pretty simple one, but you can see here if you want patient identifier, and that's something that can have both a system and a code. So there's a syntax for saying, oh, I'm looking for patient.identifier, and I'm giving the system and then a vertical bar or pipe, and then the actual code within it. Or here, the observation we're looking for with a LOINC code of 1234-1. So you can see there's the system and then the code. And there's all kinds of things in here that about how dates work and are resolved, how you can do greater thans, because again, we're bound by URL syntax here. So you can't just put an angle bracket here for greater than or less than. So as you get into these things, we have GE and NE. What's one? No, I was trying to see if there was going to be a simple one to search instead of making everyone scroll through, but here we go, prefixes. So you can see that now you can specify not equal, greater than, less than, and just how these work on the different data types as well. So a lot here, and that's just on the basics of search, because then you get into things like chaining and everything else. So that will be a future video, but again, this page is here, and I'll have some links to some other information as well. So with that, we've kind of covered how you can interact with a FHIR server manually. We've covered where you can go to find test servers, and we've gone through some examples of creating, searching, and deleting. So I think all this again was on unauthenticated servers, so just plain exposed servers that are out there. The next video will cover smart authentication, and it's just a layer kind of standardizing OAuth to give you a little preview of what's next. But again, if there's any information that would be more useful or additional content you're looking for, please let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and or subscribe. Thanks everyone. Cheers.